different entities, ranging from cities, for example. So we inform cities on how they can achieve their net zero targets, and it's again using carbon accounting for that. We look at companies and try to verify or check at least the statements they make in terms of the carbon footprints they have. They're based oftentimes on self-reporting, and they're quite fanciful, wishful numbers they provide. And so there's no real mechanism to check that. So we're working on using different data sets to quantify and check those self-reported measures. And then we look at policies like carbon taxation and what it means for different population groups, and also crises such as the Ukrainian crisis, the US-China trade war, and what does it mean? And my main interest oftentimes is the distributional effect. So what does it mean for the poorest in poor countries, but also in rich countries? So what are the distributional impacts of policies that we have?
Yeah, that's quite a large range of interest you're working on. Yeah, from household to city to company, and also some most recent international relationship. You want to capitalize that and do that under the ecological system. So that's it's fantastic. Yeah. So let's come to the second question. I understand that input-out model is the major method you use for many years, and you have also supervised lots of famous researchers in this field. Could you please introduce the method briefly to us? How
Okay,
it
thanks.
works? Yeah.
I will give you a 2-hour lecture. No, IO, I don't think is my main approach. I'm driven by interesting research questions, and I choose the method that is most suited to answer the question. So it's not always input-output analysis, and I think less than half of my publications are based on IO, but never mind. I never counted actually. So what is input-output analysis? It's based on input-output tables that are from national accounts that are produced by most countries around the world. And it allows us to calculate the social, economic, and environmental impacts of production and consumption decisions of, as I mentioned before, of households, cities, regions, countries, and globally. And the beauty for me is that it allows to measure the round by round effects or layers of impacts throughout the global value chain. So we can assess the effects considering the entire global web of production interactions. And that's for me the beauty of the approach.
Yeah, thanks. I think most of the audience here, they have some they might have some know the input output method a little bit, so it's not very too it could be familiar to us here. So the third question is what more details about the method. The MRO model is a static model that usually overlooks feedback and side effects. So is that possible to integrate it with dynamic economic models to reduce uncertainty in technology investment and consumption changes across sectors? And what alternative technology development pathways could be explored?
Okay, well, I don't fully agree with the statement that it overlooks feedback and side effects. So the MRO, so we use multi-regional input-output models. It does incorporate feedback, of course, between sectors and consumers, within and between countries and producers, and between regions, and even has feedback, as we know, on the environment. In other words, it shows how our decisions, as I said earlier, lead to environmental pressures or impact, and it can show how environmental or other constraints impact the economy. So it has this feedback between, to some extent, between the environmental system and the economy, or the other way around, between the economy and the environment. So plenty of feedback interactions, but it doesn't have double coupled natural environmental systems. So that's missing, but that's not unique to input-output analysis. I think that's the problem of many models, and also integrated assessment models do that in very incomplete ways. So the other question was how to make it dynamic. So of course there's the classic economic dynamic input-output models that go back to Leontief, and that has investments endogenous. And then there's recursive dynamics, similar to also to CGE models, where you can change certain elements of the setup and then rerun the model and report those changes. So for example, Leontief and Duchin used what they call a case study approach, where they project technologies, future technologies. They could be based on expert interviews or technical publications exogenously, and replaced current technologies. And then you rerun the model and see what differences it makes. So you run these models in recursive steps, but it's not truly dynamic. And then there are less frequent attempts to make I/O dynamic. And so there are very few applications of combining I/O with agent-based models. So where the agents make technology choices based on, it could be costs, or it could be social pressure, it could be many different decision rules. So that's quite exciting in a way. But there's only conceptual ideas on how to do that. And then finally, and there is again a bit more extensive literature, is to combine input-output tables with system dynamics. And so, for example, we have been working on a new generation integrated assessment models that's based on system dynamics, but it has an I/O, MRIO in fact, so a multi-regional input-output table at its core. And so it allows the combination of very detailed accounts, so the provided by the MRIO, in this case Axiobase, which has fairly reasonable country and sector detail and a wide range of environmental indicators. And it's embodied within a system dynamics framework that allows us to model, for example, as in this project, decarbonization pathways for the US and China, since it's Horizon and China most co-funded project, and see what spillover effects that has, who are the winners and losers along global value chains, what are co-benefits of decarbonization pathways, and what are the effects of different technologies. So to summarize, there are quite a few approaches to make it dynamic. So it's not quite fair anymore to say I/O is a static model, but of course, for the purposes of for environmental accounts or carbon footprinting, it is oftentimes the static model that's used, but probably entirely appropriate for the purpose that it's used for. And again, it's the question that determines the model we use and the approach we use. So oftentimes static I/O is just perfectly fine for what we try to achieve.
Yeah, thanks, Klaus. Actually there are some debates for a long time about the statics and the dynamic issues of IO, and this is always the questions will be asked for when a paper is reviewed. Yeah, but thanks for your opinion and some discussion insights of how to make it dynamic. Yeah. Then we come to some case problem, some real world problem questions for you. So it's about the EU's policy. So how should the EU adopt policies for stable material supply during the green transitions? And how can collaborations between governments, business, non-government organizations, and the public aid in addressing material demand challenges and promoting the green transitions?
Hmm. Okay, so it's not only limited to the EU, but you're focusing in your question um, on the EU. But so the EU, what's happening is replacing or trying to replace one dependency on fossil fuels and, for example, Russian gas, um, and tries to with the and also driven, of course, by decarbonization goals, and replaces that dependency with renewable energy sources, but they also require uh, materials, rare earth minerals, and such as cobalt, lithium, and platinum, for example. And so at the same time, the concentration in terms of suppliers of these new minerals that are needed is much higher than what we have experienced in terms of our old dependencies, Russian gas or Saudi oil, as most of these rare earth minerals are to a large extent processed and often also extracted from just very few countries. So the supply chain is dominated mainly by uh, China and a few other countries. So what we do is, in our quest for decarbonization, is replace one dependency with another one. So I think that's quite interesting aspect to the discussion. So the EU and the US and other countries or regions are now looking into closing these supply chain loops to and replace with domestic or at least alternative sourcing. And here our approach, MRIO, is again very useful because it can help identify the vulnerabilities and risk of the current or alternative global value chain, supply chains or value chains. Yeah. So in our own research, for example, we looked at the decarbonization goals of the EU, different scenarios of different types of technologies, where what sort of materials are needed, but also what sort of jobs are required, who are the winners and losers, what are the skill levels, what are the effects of on gender. And so we looked specifically at the European Green Deal and what are the spillover effects to achieve the requirements of the Green Deal, but also the spillover effects. What does it mean in terms of resource requirements from other countries? So if, for example, we have afforestation goals within the EU and set aside land for carbon sequestration, reduce agricultural production within the EU, we need more imports of agricultural products from elsewhere. So the question then becomes, where is that stuff coming from? What's the institutional situation in those countries? Does it lead to to deforestation? What does that then mean? Oftentimes it's say Brazil, Indonesia, depending on the products. What does it mean in terms of land-based carbon emissions? What does it mean in terms of biodiversity? So these are all quite interesting and complex problems. And MRO can really, and global value chain analysis can really help to identify those vulnerabilities along global value chains, the spillover effects in terms of unintended environmental destruction elsewhere, and also find out about the winners and losers along the global value chain. I think was there anything else to your question? You said something about collaboration.
Yeah, collaboration between the governments, be it is non-government organizations, multi-actors, collaborations.
Hmm. Now that's an interesting one. Our economic system is based, of course, on competition and the legal framework that protects knowledge. rather than freely sharing information. And we see that also in academia. And here now we start slowly in being more collaborative and sharing, but that partly has to be enforced by funding agencies and journals that we have to submit our data. And I think such a mechanism is needed also at the global level that brings people to collaborate more to achieve common goals. But at the moment, it seems we are moving towards a worst case scenario in terms of defragmentation and non-cooperation between the various countries. So at the moment, the situation looks a little bit bleak, but of course it's an interesting year with the super election year, and so
Mhm.
let's see how that works out. But so what I think is what's needed is global institutions like the IPCC and so on that tries to find solutions, help bring the various players to the table in the COPs and so on. But as I started out by saying, it's not built into the current economic system and political economy, so it has to be enforced almost in the framework for the economy to work rather than the other way around, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Klaus. Let's come to the next question. Next one is about carbon inequality, so which is your recent research focus. So, what can we do to mitigate the inequality in your
Hmm.
point of view?
Yeah, yeah, indeed, that's a topic that captivates me the most the last couple of years is to look at the differences in terms of the carbon implications of our decisions and how different households contribute differently, and the enormous, as also as a reflection of the enormous inequality that we see within and between countries. And so we and then many other authors since then showed how a small elite consumes a fairly large share of or is responsible in a way, taking consumption-based emissions, accounting um, for a large share of carbon emissions, and also in the future is quickly using up, or I could say, we are part of the global elites um, here in Europe, using up the remaining carbon budget very quickly. And so, and so we try to quantify the extent of inequality, but also how different policy measures, carbon taxation, for example, is regressive in many cases, how uh, subsidies, so there's still more fossil fuel subsidies than um, more than compensating the carbon taxation globally. I think it was 22, $1.6 trillion dollars. So there's still enormous amounts of fossil fuel subsidies and investments, of course. And those subsidies tend to be progressive, meaning helping mostly the higher income households. So that's the background. So the question then is, or your question then
How
was,
to mitigate that?
yeah, how to reduce that? And one,
Yeah.
of course, um, is what we need to do is to investigate the effects of any policy or measure and ask what does it do to improve the situation of the poorest, or avoid at least or create the least harm to them. And it sounds obvious in a way, but as I explained initially, many policies are often regressive, meaning that they hurt the poorest the most. So we need to have some sort of check for each policies of the effects it has. And by avoiding those effects on the poorest, I think we automatically then also reduce the carbon inequality. And another option is, of course, redistribution through progressive taxation and other means. And so, and so we look, for example, at policies, global carbon taxation policies, and recycling. So our argument is that despite very high the cost of living crisis and energy price increases, we should still have a carbon taxation, but use it also. And we run different scenarios and show different ways of recycling the revenues from carbon taxation back through different ways like proxy means testing and so on. And what's the best way to combine carbon taxation or carbon pricing more generally with helping the poorest through poverty alleviation and what it means in terms of carbon budget and so on. So it's a fairly complex question, actually. But again, input-output analysis is quite a suitable tool to investigate that. And so we do that in combination with CGE, so computational general equilibrium models, and MRO, I think, is a nice combination. And then most recently with the combination also with IAMs, so integrated assessment models.
Yeah. Thanks. So the last question for today's interview is, what factors should young scholars prioritize when planning academic careers? And do you have any advice on selecting research area and overcoming challenges? How can they maintain resilience and motivation when they met challenges? So what do you think?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I have a couple of items, I think, but not necessarily in that order. So what's needed is just based on supervising quite a few PhD students over time and looking at why they potentially drop out or have dropped out and the kind of struggles they have. So one, of course, is grit or perseverance. So I see many people drop out because of all kinds of issues on the way. And so you just, as a student, and there is a researcher later on, more senior, it's always the same. You just have to stick with it and learn to deal with setbacks, rejection letters, and, be aware that the review process can be a bit random at times, and just not take it personally and just get on with it. Another important aspect is balance. Again, I see many people drop out after a really good start. They write a bunch of papers, but then they get burned out during that process. And I think it's really important to need to have hobbies and fun outside academia, because academia can be often a very unhealthy environment. We know from many surveys around, at least in Europe and the US, there's a high rate of depression amongst PhD students, and also the university tends to be a pyramid scheme. So everybody, of course, wants to become a professor, but it's a very small part that manages to do so. Another point is to maintain interest and curiosity. So how to do that? I think it's important to read widely. What I see with my students, oftentimes they're very focused on just doing their PhD. I'm expert on a very small area, but it's important to read outside the immediate research topic and look across research areas or the discipline, outside the discipline, for connections. The best research, in my mind, often comes from cross-fertilization from other disciplines and from outside one's own field. So I think it's important to be aware of what's happening outside and read outside and waste some time that way. I think that's totally fine. That's how it should be. Then why? you to be aware of why you do it. It's about the research, uh, sharing and collaboration, help answering important questions, and not so much the focus on the number of publications and the impact factor and competition. I think that's what academia has turned into, unfortunately. Of course, having said that, I think it's important to play to some extent the rules of the game. So, in contradiction to what I just said, you have to look at the number of publications and impact factors, but be a little bit subversive about it. So you need to know the rules of the games. But because they buy you some degrees of freedom. So if you have your publications, then you can buy yourself the freedom to also do more of the stuff you want to do and so on. So I think these are my main thoughts that come to mind. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks for your suggestions to the younger generation and the early career. Thank you. We have some guests today. They are also the editorial board members of our journal, so they were gonna ask questions to you. But before that, before we go into the questions, we will take a photo together. So can everybody, could you please open your open your camera, and then we will take screenshot as a photo. 对，各位老师同学，如果方便的话，可以打开摄像头，然后这个期刊编辑一下，就截个图作为这个拍照。
Quite a few familiar faces. Nice to see you all.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you.
Okay, you got it? Great. Okay, let's go into the discussion session. So we have three guests. The first is Kai-Hui Song from UC Berkeley. Hello, Kai-Hui, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Yuli. Hi, Klaus.
Hi.
It's fascinating. Thank you for this interview and for sharing these insightful thoughts. Actually, it really inspires scholars in different career stages. And I'm very fascinated about the applications of MRIO in addressing some local environmental issues. And especially right now, we are promoting some subnational climate actions, for example. My question is, what do you think of some of the challenges and like opportunities for applying this multi-regional input model in local climate decision makings? Would you like to share some thoughts and insights about it? Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, nice to see you again. Well, that's a really interesting question. Because also, as you know, MRIO is based on national accounts, so the unit of the data we use is country level data, right? But I said that we also oftentimes so we use it for at the company level, right? And we also use it for cities quite a bit for scope 3 emissions, and the question then becomes on your starting point. So if you have a specific city, so in our case, we're in Groningen now in the Netherlands, so you have to take the national input-output table for the Netherlands and have to downscale it, right? So it's a problem always how to best downscale it. And it becomes even more difficult. We looked at African cities, for example, because that's a place where most of the population growth is taking place over in this century, and especially medium-sized cities. And the data situation is really lousy, even at the national level, right? And so the question then becomes on finding alternative data sources, using remote sensing data, using big data, and so on. I think that's a big problem, but also an exciting opportunity in a way to look at different data sources and how to link that to the accounting framework. And so the same is true for households, for example. We use oftentimes consumer expenditure surveys, right? Um, and so alternatives again are that we use credit card information data, that we use so-called big data, and combine them and link them to the MRO framework. So the beauty of it that it's a very nice starting point, a framework to link all kinds of other data sources to it. And so I think these are challenges, but also opportunities in a way too. And I think MRO has really come a long way in the last couple of years in terms of these extensions and add-ons and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Kevin. Now we have Professor Xiaoyu Yan from the University of Essex. Hello, Xiaoyu.
Hello, hi. Thanks, Ili. Thanks, Klaus. It was really interesting to hear your story about your research. I wonder whether you have any suggestions on how we approach the kind of allocation of carbon budgets to different economic sectors. So, for example, if we say we start from let's say a national carbon budget, how do we then allocate that to different economic sectors and even subsectors within each economic sector? What would be your approach?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm usually not really bothered too much in terms of sectors because it's in my mind, the final demand that then determines the types of sectors and so on, right? But it becomes important because some of the sectors are not are difficult to decarbonize, right? We can't electrify everything. We need certain degrees of temperature for industrial processes of say 2000 degrees and so on that we couldn't deal with electricity. And so if we manage to have a renewable power sector, for example, then we still have problems in other sectors, and they take parts of the carbon budget away. And there was just 2 weeks ago, I think, a study that looked at the internet and how much that takes away. And there is the whole AI situation that and the energy requirements and so on. So your question becomes more and more pertinent in terms of, well, what happens to our carbon budget? And so, and just listing those sectors, I become almost desperate because there is this increasing requirements of energy. And the latest number I've seen 2-3 weeks ago was 200 gigatons left to have a 50% chance to stay probability to stay within 1.5 degree, and so that's what 4 years left. So well, in terms of approach, it's clearly IO is clearly well suited to do that, except some of the sectors we don't have yet. So the many of these IO products, the global MROs that are out there, have different. So they have the different degrees of sectoral disaggregation, sectoral detail, country detail, and so some of them, cryptos, AI, we would have to see where they fit, for example. So again, the framework is the IO, but then we need to use other ways of complementing that, say LCA studies and so on, to help with the disaggregation and so on. But yeah, it's a nice question. I haven't thought about it that way, but now that you say it, it's a good one.
Yeah, it could be a really interesting research topic.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I think that's all from me. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Xiaoyu. And then we have Professor Junian Song from Jilin University, and he's visiting UCL. Hi, Junian.
Okay. Hello, Klaus, and hello, Yuli. Very nice to have a
Hi.
talk with you. Klaus, thank you so much for your opinions on integrating the statistic IO model with other methods to make dynamic predictions. So following the previous question of Xiaoyu, I would also like to talk with you about some IO methodology. So purely by the IO model itself, when dealing with the task of using L model to predict future investment on new technologies or new sectors for their expansion, we sometimes resort to capital accumulation. So the new investment is assumed to be accumulated as new capital stock for the next year. So here always comes a question. The investment for a sector is not exactly equal to its capital formation. And there is always difficulty in determining how the total investment can be allocated to all sectors to form their own capital formation. I think that the Japanese researchers, they often have such kind of uh, allocation metrics. But for other researchers in other countries, there always lacks such an allocation metrics that analyzes the intermediate input coefficient metrics. So the absence of these allocation metrics is always limiting simulations using IL model, purely by IL model itself without integrating it with other methods. So I would like to hear some of your opinions on this regard.
Yeah, that is a big problem. Yeah, and it's also difficult because we have that from a couple of, say, countries or case studies, and you mentioned the Japanese, and the question then becomes, can you apply those to other countries, and especially given that we want to use global MRIOs, and I mentioned the African situation and so on. So there is no real good answer to that problem on how to do that best. I'm really at a loss to what to advise there. So it's a very difficult question because we have lack of data, and I myself haven't worked much on that specific problem, on how to deal with investments and so on. So what we do is we develop scenarios based on the literature. We try to come up with find some numbers that we have and try to plug them in where they belong within the framework, and then try to rebalance, use RAS. It's not very nice or elegant, but sometimes it's just the only way to do it. So we use something similar to what Leontiev and Duchin did long time ago, which is using a case study approach. So they use literature based on technological literature and so on. Learning curve approaches, for example. I don't know specifically if they use learning curve approaches, but what you do is you look at different types of technologies, assess their potential trajectories, and use that kind of information. So again, the framework is the IO, but the data source oftentimes comes from elsewhere. And I know for example, your colleague at UCL, Jing Meng, she for our project, she looks in great detail at a wide range of more than 100 different technologies, right? And so we don't look at the investments per se, but we skip that and just input the technologies by themselves in a future A matrix, so to say, right? So we don't do it via investments, which is required, say, for the traditional dynamic I/O model, but we, in the case of recursive dynamics, we just take the technology of the future, so to say, plug it into the accounting framework, and then rerun the model. And I think that's a decent way of doing it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your question.
Thanks. Now we have 8 minutes left. Let me look at the chat box. I can only pick up some of the questions from that because I don't have enough time.
You can always send me an email if you like to.
Yeah, afterwards, yeah. So here's one question. So reviewers often query the quality and the reliable of MRO datasets, asking for unnecessarily sensitive analysis that contribute little or nothing to the research question being answered. What's your advice on this for MRO researchers?
Yeah, referees often ask all kinds of weird questions, huh? I'm not opposed to sensitivity analysis. So the question though is how to do it best, right? And to justify. So people use Monte Carlo oftentimes, but it's not ideal. So you try to figure out what's the most important factor of change and try to modify that to make a sensitivity analysis. But if you really feel it doesn't add anything, then you can also argue that in your response. You really have to have a feel on what you can get away with, right? Sometimes it's just best to do it to please the referee because you don't want to get into an argument, but it has to make sense, right? And so, in general, I think having some probabilistic expressions, sensitivity analysis, Monte Carlo type stuff is indeed not a bad idea. And the quality of the MRIOs, that is more generally a problem. And so, but again, you would choose your MRIO database based on the question at hand, right? So I wouldn't use always the same. In fact, we use all of them depending on what's best for the purpose at hand. And so then you can argue, I use this one because of this question, because of that level of aggregation and country detail, because of this type of environmental indicators provided, and it's the best to answer the question. It's better therefore than any of the other ones. So well, I'm rambling on, but you have it's a relative problem you have, right? So what's the best way of answering your question and what are the alternatives, right?
Yeah. Another question is about the key issues. So what would you consider key issues that MRO have not yet been applied, despite potential to do so? Something like the future, the outlook of applying MRO.
Yeah, well, I think I kind of answered that a little bit with an earlier question on Guihong's question on the city level accounting. And so the question is, the problem is that it's a national level data set. And when we look at environmental impact somewhere, so it's not a problem for carbon. Carbon is fine, it's a global pollutant. But if we look, say, carbon from land use, then we have a serious problem, right? Once we need spatially explicit data because of land use, because of infrastructure and so on, then MRO falls short. We can still use it as a framework, but we need other models that allow us to zoom in within a country in terms of inter-regional supply chains to get to fine gridded data in terms of water stress and so on. So it really depends on, again, on the research question. But I think the spatial aspect is one of the biggest challenges, and the beauty about it is the openness to add atmospheric models, spatially explicit models, big data sets, and so on. And I think that's where the innovation lies, and also the power of the framework.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we have one last question. So we have a paper, and one of the hypotheses it was not support, and the certified forest area of EU countries positively influenced the carbon stocks in living biomass. So what is your point of view on that finding?
It's not quite an IO question, right?
No.
And so I would need to know a bit more about the situation, because forests are in a steady state situation, right? They only show additivity during the growth phase, right? So they absorb carbon. And so, but what's interesting about the whole forest stuff is after we cut them down and how to count for durables and so on. It's an accounting question, but not an MRO question necessarily. I think there are all kinds of interesting research questions around that, but I don't understand enough of the context of this question to answer it.
Yeah, maybe need more details and background
Yeah,
information.
I think so.
Yeah. Another more. So from your point of view, what is the main reliable data set to retrieve data about greenhouse gas emissions per capita by country? Which one is the most reliable?
Well, per capita, so it depends. If it's you just take averages, or if you want to know differences between different types of consumers and so on. And then you need some modeling to get there. So it really depends on your consumer segments, what you call it, types of consumers you want, if it's the different income categories, if you want to use consumer expenditure surveys, or what we did recently, if you use big data approaches. So there's no, for averages, is one thing, but in terms of the kind of research I do, where we look at different types of households, then it's a question of using different types of models, credit card information, and so on, and to calculate a carbon footprint for different types of households. So I'm a bit avoiding the question because it depends on on what exactly you want to do in terms of household carbon footprints.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we almost run out of time. Lynn, are you there?
Yeah.
So is that okay to finish this interview and close the conversation?
Yes. Thank you, Klaus. Thank you, Yili. We really appreciate for your time, and thank you for give us a super cool interview, and thank you all attendance. And we hope everyone enjoyed this interview, and we will upload the video to the journal's webpage once the video editing is finished. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us via emails. And hope all guys have a good day and have a good weekend.
Thank you all. It was nice meeting you
Bye.
and seeing you again. Bye bye. Thanks for the
Bye.
questions.
Bye.